Welcome, restless souls, to Carmen's Crypt. I'm Carmen Carrion, keeper of forgotten tales and curator of nightmares. You've wandered into my domain, where each week I unearth a fresh horror from the depths of human imagination. In these darkened halls, stories wait like hungry shadows. Each tale we've collected whispers of terrors both ancient and new. From crumbling mansions where something skitters behind the walls, to that strange text message you received at 3 a.m. from a number that shouldn't exist. So gather close. The candles are lit, the shadows grow long, and the witching hour is upon us. Are you prepared to face what lurks in the darkest recesses of Carmen's Crypt? Lock your doors, still your nerves, and remember, here, every fear comes alive. This is Carmen's Crypt. Your sanctuary of scares awaits. They say, if you walk along Wicker Creek Road after midnight, you might hear whistling. Not the cheerful kind that accompanies a morning stroll or signals to a friend across the street. This whistling is different. A haunting three-note melody that seems to float on the night air, like a spirit searching for something it lost long ago. If you hear it, don't whistle back. Don't even look around to find its source. Just keep walking, eyes forward, until you're safely past the old covered bridge that marks the boundary between Wicker Creek and the neighboring town of Milldale. At least that's what my grandmother told me when I was a child visiting her farmhouse for the summer. Back then, her warning seemed like just another folk tale, meant to keep children from wandering too far from home after dark. The kind of story that loses its power once you grow up and realize the monsters under your bed were never real. But Grandmother Reed wasn't one for idle superstition. She was a practical woman who believed in hard work and common sense. So, when she spoke of the whistler with that grave look in her eyes, the same look she wore when warning us about very real dangers, like the bull in Mackerson's field, or the current in the deeper parts of the creek, I couldn't help but wonder if there was more to her story than childish fantasy. It was 1943, she told me one evening as we sat on her porch, the setting sun casting shadows across her property. Jacob Miller was walking home late from the Wicker Creek Tavern. He had stayed too long, had too much to drink, and missed the last bus back to Milldale. His wife was expecting their first child any day, and he should have been home hours ago. Grandmother rocked slowly in her chair, her weathered hands folded in her lap. The moon was full that night, so Jacob could see well enough to follow the road. He was about halfway home when he heard it. A whistle, clear as day, coming from the woods to his right. Now Jacob, he was a friendly sort, even when he'd been drinking. So naturally, he whistled back the same tune. Thought maybe it was another fellow traveler making his way home through the woods, instead of taking the longer road around. She paused then, her eyes fixed on something distant that only she could see. Jacob never made it home that night. They found his body 3 days later, at the bottom of a ravine about 50 yards into the woods. The fall had broken his neck, they said. A terrible accident. But those who found him said his face. She shook her head. His face was frozen in an expression of pure terror, and there were marks around his throat, like fingerprints, but too long and too thin to belong to any human hand. I must have looked skeptical, because Grandmother leaned forward, her voice dropping to nearly a whisper. You wonder why a ghost would do such a thing, why it would call out only to harm those who answer. She settled back in her rocker, the wood creaking beneath her as she began a tale I'd never heard before. The whistler has haunted that bridge for longer than I've been alive. His name was Elias Thorne, a poor farmhand son who fell in love with Rebecca Woodward back in 1897. Grandmother reached up and touched a locket she also wore around her neck. I'd seen it before, but never what was inside. She opened it now, revealing a tiny faded photograph of a young woman with dark hair arranged in an old-fashioned style. "Rebecca Woodward," she said softly. "My grandmother." My breath caught. This was the first time Grandmother had ever mentioned being related to someone from her Whistler story. "Her father owned half the land in Wicker Creek," she continued, "and she was promised to the son of another wealthy family, but she fell in love with Elias Thorne, who worked their fields. Love rarely cares about such arrangements." Grandmother's eyes took on a faraway look. "They met in secret for months, always at the covered bridge, which was new built then. Elias would wait in the shadows and whistle those 3 notes, and Rebecca would slip out of her house to meet him. When Rebecca's engagement was announced, they planned to run away together. Elias waited at the bridge with 2 horses, whistling their signal into the night. But Rebecca's brother had discovered their plan. He locked his sister away and gathered a group of men who went to the bridge and found Elias still waiting, still whistling for his love." Grandmother's voice grew solemn. "They beat him badly, then hanged him from the bridge. His last breath came out as that same whistle, a final call to the woman who would never answer." I leaned forward, confused. "But you said Rebecca was your grandmother. If she met Elias that night—" Grandmother nodded slowly. 3 days later, when Rebecca learned what happened, she was devastated. What her family didn't know was that she was already carrying Elias's child. My mother. Rebecca was so overcome with grief that she went to the bridge and threw herself into the ravine below, the same place where they find his victims now. Her family covered it up, claiming it was an accident, and forced her to marry the man they had chosen once she recovered from her injuries. But she named her daughter Eliza, after Elias. She looked at me intently, her eyes searching my face. "The women in our family have always resembled Rebecca. My mother, myself, your mother, and you, Elizabeth. You look more like her than any of us." A chill ran down my spine, despite the warm evening air. "Ever since that night," Grandmother continued, "people say Elias's spirit remains at the bridge, whistling eternally for Rebecca. When someone answers his call, he appears to them, hoping, just for a moment, that it might be her. But when he realizes it's not, that it's just another stranger mocking his pain by imitating their private signal," she drew a finger slowly across her throat, "his grief turns to rage." She fixed me with a penetrating stare. "That's why you must never whistle back. Never. He's not calling to you or anyone else walking those roads at night. He's calling to her, and he doesn't take kindly to impostors." She hesitated, then added in a whisper, "And that's why you must be especially careful, Elizabeth. With your face, he might mistake you for her, only to discover you're not truly his Rebecca. I can't imagine what his rage would be then." That was the summer I turned 12, old enough to dismiss ghost stories, but young enough to feel a chill when walking past the covered bridge at dusk. Young enough that when my friends dared me to walk Wicker Creek Road at midnight, I refused, inventing excuses about Grandmother's strict curfew rather than admit my fear. I left Wicker Creek behind when summer ended, returning to my parents' home in the city. As the years passed, I visited grandmother less frequently. College, career, relationships, life has a way of pulling you along its current, away from the tributaries of childhood. By the time I reached my 30s, the Whistler had become nothing more than a faded memory, a quaint rural legend I might occasionally mention at parties when the conversation turned to hometown superstitions. Then Grandmother Reed died. It was peaceful, they said. She went to sleep one night and simply didn't wake up the next morning. A blessing at 87. I took a week off work to return to Wicker Creek for her funeral and to help settle her affairs. The farmhouse hadn't changed much in 20 years. The paint was peeling in places, and the porch sagged slightly to one side, but it was still the same sturdy structure that had sheltered generations of my family. Inside, everything remained as if frozen in time. The same faded floral wallpaper, the same creaky floorboards, the same faint smell of cinnamon and cloves that always lingered in her kitchen. I spent my days sorting through grandmother's belongings, deciding what to keep, what to donate, what to throw away. It was tedious, emotional work, and I often found myself working late into the evening. One night, well past midnight, I was in the attic going through a trunk of old photographs when I came across an envelope labeled simply J.M. Inside was a yellowed newspaper clipping from the Milldale Gazette, dated June 18, 1943. The headline read, "Local man found dead in Wicker Creek Ravine." Below was a grainy photograph of Jacob Miller, a young man with a serious expression and neatly combed hair, wearing his Sunday best. The article matched grandmother's story almost exactly, though it made no mention of marks on the victim's throat. It described Jacob as a respected member of the community who was survived by his wife, Eleanor, and a newborn son, Thomas. I sat back on my heels, stunned. All these years, I'd assumed the Whistler was just another boogeyman, invented to keep children in line. But Jacob Miller had been real. He had lived and died just as grandmother had described, which made me wonder what else about her story might be true. Beneath the newspaper clipping was another envelope, this one much older and tied with a faded ribbon. Inside, I found a daguerreotype of a young woman in 19th century dress. Even through the aging of the image, the resemblance was unmistakable. She could have been me in costume. This must be Rebecca Woodward, my great-great-grandmother. I didn't intend to find out more. Really, I didn't. But the next evening, after another long day of sorting and packing, I found myself restless. The farmhouse felt too quiet, too empty without grandmother's presence. I decided to take a walk to clear my head. It was a warm June night, not unlike the one Jacob Miller had experienced 80 years earlier. The moon was nearly full, illuminating the country road with silver light. Without conscious decision, my feet carried me toward Wicker Creek Road and the old covered bridge. I wasn't thinking about the Whistler. At least, I told myself I wasn't. I was thinking about grandmother, about Rebecca, about a family history I'd never fully understood until now. I was so lost in these thoughts that I didn't immediately register when I passed the weathered sign marking the boundary of Wicker Creek. The covered bridge loomed ahead, a dark mouth in the moonlight. It had been restored since my childhood, the rotting planks replaced, the roof reinforced. Still, it retained its antiquated charm, a relic from a time when horses and carriages were the primary means of transportation. I paused at the bridge's entrance, suddenly aware of how far I'd walked and how isolated I was. The houses along this stretch of road were few and far between, most of them dark at this hour. The night was still, The only sounds the distant call of an owl and the soft rustle of leaves stirring in the occasional breeze. That's when I heard it. A chill ran down my spine, raising goosebumps along my arms despite the warm night air. The whistle had come from somewhere in the woods to my right, exactly as Grandmother had described in her story. I stood frozen, my heart hammering against my ribs. It was just a coincidence, I told myself. Probably a night bird or even another person out for a late walk. There was no reason to panic. The whistle came again, closer this time. I remembered Grandmother's warning. Don't whistle back. Don't even look around. And most importantly, with my face that so resembled Rebecca's, I should never let the whistler see me. I should have turned around then, walked quickly back to the farmhouse, locked the door behind me, and laughed at my own foolishness in the morning light. That's what any sensible person would have done. But curiosity has always been my downfall. And in that moment, standing on the threshold of the covered bridge, with the moon casting my elongated shadow before me, I made a decision that I would come to regret. I whistled back. The sound left my lips before I could reconsider, a perfect mimicry of the melody I'd heard. For a moment, there was only silence. Even the owl had gone quiet. Then, much closer now, definitely coming from the trees directly beside the road. No more than 20 yards away. I squinted into the darkness between the trunks, but could make out nothing beyond vague shapes and shadows. "Hello?" I called, my voice sounding unnaturally loud in the stillness. "Is someone there?" No response, not even another whistle. I took a step toward the woods, then stopped. What was I doing? Hadn't Grandmother specifically warned against this exact behavior? I turned back toward the bridge, intending to cross it quickly and make my way to the nearest house in Milldale. That's when I saw him. A figure stood at the far end of the bridge, silhouetted against the moonlit road beyond. A man, tall and thin, wearing what happened to be old-fashioned clothes from another century. He was perfectly still, his posture unnaturally rigid. Though I couldn't make out his features in the darkness, I had the distinct impression he was watching me. "Excuse me," I called, my voice wavering slightly. "I need to get past." The figure didn't move or respond. Instead, it tilted its head at an unnatural angle, as if straining to see me better in the moonlight. Then, slowly, it raised one long arm, not in a threatening gesture, but in what almost seemed like recognition. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but to where? The figure blocked my path forward, and I was reluctant to turn my back on him to flee in the direction I'd come. And the woods were no longer an option, not with that whistle still echoing in my memory. As I stood paralyzed with indecision, the figure began to walk toward me. Its movements were wrong somehow, jerky and uncoordinated, like a marionette controlled by an unskilled puppeteer. Each step was accompanied by a faint creaking sound, like old floorboards protesting under weight. In the diffuse moonlight filtering through the bridge's roof, I could now see the figure more clearly. It wore a suit, like those in photographs from the 1890s, but the fabric was rotted and stained with dark patches that I desperately hoped were not blood. Its hands hung at its sides, fingers unnaturally long and ending in what looked more like talons than human nails. But it was the face that sent me stumbling backward in shock. The figure had no face, just smooth, pale skin, stretched tightly over a skull-like structure. Where eyes should have been, there were only deep, empty sockets. The nose was merely a slight protrusion with two dark nostrils, and the mouth was a thin, lipless gash that stretched from ear to ear. As I watched in horror, that gash began to widen, not in the snarling grimace I expected, but in what almost seemed like wonder. A sound emerged from it, not a growl or roar, but a whisper carried on static.
Rebecca? Rebecca, is it truly you?
I was too terrified to speak, too frozen to move. The creature drifted closer, its head tilting this way and that as it studied my face. Its spectral hand reached toward me, those elongated fingers stopping just short of touching my cheek.
You've come back to me,
it whispered, the voice now clearer, almost human.
After all these years.
Something in me knew I should correct this misunderstanding immediately. Tell this thing I wasn't Rebecca, that I was just Elizabeth Reed, a distant descendant who happened to share her features. But some deeper instinct warned that shattering its illusion might be deadly. I began, not sure what I would say. The creature's fingers finally made contact with my face, the touch like ice against my skin. I shuddered involuntarily, but forced myself not to pull away.
So warm,
it murmured, wonder in its hollow voice.
So alive. I'd almost forgotten.
Its featureless face drew closer to mine, the lipless mouth now curved in what might have been a smile. The empty eye sockets seemed to drink in my features, memorizing them.
I've waited so long,
it said, the voice growing stronger.
So many nights calling for you, so many who answered who weren't you.
A note of anger crept into his voice.
Impostors, mockers. But you came back, at last.
My mind raced. If I told the truth, revealed I wasn't Rebecca, I had no doubt this creature would tear me apart in its rage. But if I pretended to be my great-great-grandmother, where would that lead? I decided to tread carefully. I heard your call, I said softly. The creature's entire form seemed to tremble with joy.
You remember our signal. Of course you do. Love never truly forgets.
Its hands moved to my shoulders, gripping them with surprising strength. But something is wrong, it said, the head tilting in confusion. You're here, but not here. I can feel you, but not completely. The creature's posture stiffened. You're still trapped. Trapped? I echoed, not understanding. In life, it hissed, as if the answer should be obvious. That's why we've been apart so long. I crossed over, but you remained. Flesh and blood, aging, dying, being reborn again and again. Its grip tightened painfully. That's why you look the same, but feel different. Your soul keeps returning, trying to find me, but trapped in new flesh each time. I began to understand the creature's terrible logic, and fear knotted in my stomach. I don't think I understand now, it interrupted, excitement building in its voice. This is why our reunion never lasts, why you appear and then vanish. Your mortal shell pulls you back to the world of the living. Its hands moved from my shoulders to my neck, the touch almost gentle. But I can free you. I can release you from this cycle. I tried to pull away then, but the creature's grip was unyielding. No, please, don't be afraid, it whispered tenderly. It hurt me too, when they did it, the rope, the fall, but only for a moment, and then freedom, then eternity. Its fingers began to tighten around my throat.
We'll be together properly this time, forever.
I struggled, clawing at those impossibly strong hands, but it was like fighting against iron bands. The creature pulled me closer, wrapping me in an embrace that felt like being submerged in ice water.
I've missed you so much, Rebecca.
It whispered against my ear as my vision began to darken at the edges.
Just a moment of pain, and then eternity together.
My hand clutched desperately at the locket in my pocket, the one containing Rebecca's photograph. If I could just show him, make him understand I wasn't her. But my strength was fading too quickly, my fumbling fingers unable to grasp it. As consciousness began to slip away, I heard the creature's voice, now sounding almost normal, almost human, a young man's voice, full of love and relief. There you are, it said softly. I can see you properly now, your soul shining through. The flesh falls away. The pressure on my throat increased, and I could feel myself slipping, falling into darkness. My last thought, strangely peaceful, was a realization that perhaps this had always been inevitable, that the women in my family had been drawn back to this place, generation after generation, because something unfinished pulled at our shared blood. Had my grandmother known? Was this why she had warned me so specifically? Not just to protect me, but because she knew someday one of us would complete the cycle. As my consciousness faded completely, I thought I felt arms catching me. Not the cold embrace of the Whistler, but something warmer, more human. A woman's arms, perhaps, and a whispered voice, not Elias's, but softer, feminine. I'm sorry. He's waited so long. They found my body 3 days later, at the bottom of the ravine beneath the old covered bridge, the same ravine where Rebecca had tried to end her own life more than a century earlier. The fall had broken my neck, they said. A terrible accident. But those who found me said my face wasn't frozen in terror like Jacob Miller's had been. I looked peaceful, serene even, with just the faintest hint of a smile. The locket with Rebecca's picture was clutched in my hand, the chain wrapped tightly around my fingers, as if I'd been holding onto it when I fell. But when they opened it, they found something inexplicable. The photograph was gone, leaving only an empty frame. They say if you walk along Wicker Creek Road after midnight, you might hear whistling. Not just one pattern now, but two distinct whistles, calling and answering each other across the night air. If you hear them, don't stop to listen. Don't look around to find their source. And whatever you do, don't whistle back. The whistler isn't alone anymore. And while he's found what he sought for over a century, there's no telling what they might want from you. Some locals say that on certain nights, especially in June, around the anniversary of when Elias Thorne was hanged, you can see two figures standing at either end of the bridge. A tall man in an antique suit, and a woman in flowing white, her face obscured by shadow. They never crossed to meet each other, forever separated by the bridge itself, forever reaching toward one another across that impassable distance. Unless, perhaps, someone answers their call. Someone who might help bridge that final gap. But who would be foolish enough to do that? Who would risk becoming part of their eternal tragic story? I did. And now, I'll never leave Wicker Creek again. You didn't hear that from me, did you? And so, dear listeners, we emerge from another dark corner of Carmen's crypt. But remember, the horrors you've heard tonight are merely echoes of the terrors that await in the shadows of your own mind. If you enjoyed your stay in the crypt, why not invite a friend to join us next week? After all, fear is best when shared. Leave a review if you dare, or share your own tales of terror on my social media. Who knows, your nightmares might just become my next story. Until next time, keep checking under your bed. And remember, in Carmen's crypt, every fear comes alive, and no one is truly safe. Sweet dreams, if you can still sleep at all.